Hey everyone. Tonight we're dimming the lights, settling in, and gently time-traveling to a world where powdered wigs were taller than most morals, and tiny humans were considered fashionable accessories. So, make yourself comfortable. Maybe you've got your tea, maybe you're under a weighted blanket, maybe your cat's already halfway asleep. Either way, tonight's story is going to drift softly through the marble corridors and gold-plated absurdities of the 18th century European courts, where nobles collected porcelain, wigs, and yes, dwarf servants. Because apparently, nothing said, "I'm rich and morally flexible," like having a human being you could treat like an animated conversation piece. Let's start slow. The fashion of the tiny courtier. By the 1700s, Europe had reached peak ridiculousness. Everything was enormous: the dresses, the hair, the egos. But then, ironically, among all that excess, a strange fascination emerged with people who were small. At Versailles, in Vienna, in Madrid, nearly every royal household had what they called court dwarfs. Sometimes they were entertainers, sometimes attendants, sometimes just decor. Yeah, people were decor. That was the thing. Now, in fairness to the weirdness of the past, this trend didn't start in the 18th century. Medieval courts had already loved a good jester or curiosity. But the 1700s were when it reached its most elaborate and its most tragic. Let's glide first to France, because where else would one start when discussing over-the-top aristocratic trends? The court of Louis XIV, the original stage for excess. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, basically invented the idea of being so royal that reality bends around you. He ruled France for 72 years, wore diamonds the size of walnuts, and woke up each morning to a symphony of nobles pretending to enjoy his company. Naturally, his court had its own collection of petits courtiers. Louis loved theater, spectacle, and hierarchy, and nothing emphasized his own divine height quite like surrounding himself with people who, physically and socially, could never stand at his level. And to be clear, these weren't circus performers. They were dressed in silk, trained in etiquette, and often used as intermediaries between nobles, or to entertain guests with their wit. But it was wit within a cage. For example, one of the most famous dwarfs at Versailles was Jean Bécu, who later became the confidant of Madame de Maintenon. She was well educated and clever, which, of course, the court loved to exploit for amusement. She could navigate gossip and flattery like a pro, which was basically the Versailles version of survival skills. But make no mistake, this position was built on humiliation. Royal courts used dwarf servants to display both wealth and control. It wasn't about compassion, it was about possession. If you had a dwarf in your retinue, it meant you could afford to collect humans like furniture. The Empress and her tiny favorites. Let's float eastward now, to Russia. Because if France made courtly absurdity glamorous, Russia made it terrifying. Empress Anna Ivanovna ruled from 1730 to 1740 and had a flair for the grotesque. She adored miniature things, miniature furniture, miniature people, and elaborate pranks that would have made modern HR departments collapse in horror. Her court dwarf, Peter the Dwarf, was one of dozens she kept. She once decided it would be hilarious to stage a mock wedding between two of her dwarfs. It wasn't voluntary. She built them a miniature ice palace, literally made of ice, and forced them to spend their wedding night inside it, in sub-zero Russian winter, because apparently cruelty was her love language. Court chroniclers described the scene as mirthful, which is, of course, a word that can mean anything when you're writing under an absolute monarch. Anna saw dwarfs as living toys, not people. They were there to amuse, to remind her of power, and to fill the endless boredom of autocracy. And if you're wondering whether anyone thought this was cruel, no, not really. In the 18th century royal mind, compassion was a word reserved for art patronage, not for actual humans. The Spanish and Austrian courts, the collector's mentality. Meanwhile, over in Spain, things took a more melancholy turn. The Habsburg dynasty had long been fond of court dwarfs, even commissioning portraits of them. If you've ever seen Diego Velázquez's paintings, you'll know what I mean. His masterpiece, Las Meninas, features Maria Barbola and Nicolásito Pertusato, two court dwarfs who served the young princess Margarita Teresa. Unlike most royal painters, Velázquez actually painted them with dignity. Their gazes are direct, intelligent, even weary. They're not props. They're people caught inside a gilded cage. The Spanish Habsburgs, like their Austrian cousins, believed that dwarfs brought luck, laughter, and loyalty. They often served as pages, tutors, or jesters. Some became trusted confidants, but they were always on display. You can see it in the portraits. They stand beside the throne, a few feet shorter, but infinitely more aware of the absurdity surrounding them. And behind that awareness lies something deeper, a constant tension between visibility and invisibility. They were seen by everyone, yet truly known by no one. Royal obsession and the culture of control. So why the obsession? Why did these royal families dripping in silk and jewels surround themselves with people they treated like collectible curiosities? Well, the answer is, as with most royal habits, both simple and depressing. It was about power, about contrast, about making themselves seem even grander by surrounding their world with deliberate difference. Every aspect of the royal environment was staged. The gardens, the gowns, the music, even the people. A dwarf servant wasn't seen as a person, but as a human punctuation mark in the grand sentence of monarchy. Their presence said, "Look how absolute my world is. Even nature's exceptions serve me." Of course, this wasn't just cruelty. It was also boredom. Aristocrats in the 18th century were trapped in endless etiquette. Having something novel, a person who broke the physical mold, became a distraction. In a world that had everything, they still needed something strange to talk about over champagne. And that, honestly, might be the saddest part. Yet many of these dwarf courtiers were sharp observers of royal life. Think about it. They were close to power, but never truly part of it. They saw everything, the gossip, the scandals, the hypocrisy, and learned to play the chessboard with remarkable skill. Some became subtle advisors, passing messages or secrets. Others used humor as armor. There's a quiet defiance in that, living in a world that sees you as decoration and still finding ways to think, learn, and survive. It's tragic, yes, but it's also oddly human. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that even in the most ridiculous palaces, humanity finds a way to peek through the cracks of gold leaf and powdered wigs. Let's drift on. So that's the beginning. The glimmering, absurd world of 18th century courts, where people turned other people into conversation pieces and called it culture. In the next part, we'll drift through the stories of a few individual dwarf courtiers, the ones who became famous, infamous, and sometimes quietly powerful behind the scenes. So, we've set the stage. We've got candlelit halls, silk rustling, bored monarchs, and an 18th century version of Instagram fame. Except instead of influencers, you had court dwarfs. And somehow the same level of emotional emptiness. Let's float into the lives of a few of the most famous of them. People who became small legends in a world obsessed with looking down on them, literally and socially. We'll start with the man who may have been the only dwarf in Europe to actually outwit nobility and get a book deal out of it. Józef Borulawski, the gentleman dwarf of Poland. Meet Józef Borulawski, born in 1339 in what was then part of Poland. He was about 3 feet tall, sharply intelligent, fluent in multiple languages, and had the kind of social instincts that could survive any courtly shark tank. From an early age, Borulawski caught the attention of local nobles, which in the 18th century was both a blessing and a trap. He was charming, graceful, and apparently had better manners than most people who towered above him. He was soon taken under the patronage of Countess Humiecka, because rich people back then loved collecting interesting humans the way modern people collect vinyl records they never play. Under her protection, he was educated and dressed like a little gentleman. He could play music, discuss politics, and quote literature. He was the perfect miniature conversationalist. And yes, that was an actual term used at the time. A tour of Europe, the 18th century talk show circuit. Eventually, Borulawski toured across Europe, basically doing the Enlightenment version of a book tour, minus the podcast interviews. He performed music, told stories, met monarchs, and was introduced at salons as a curiosity, but a cultured curiosity. He met Maria Theresa in Vienna, Frederick the Great in Prussia, and even the famous composer Haydn. People loved him, not because they saw him as equal, of course, but because he fit perfectly into the genteel spectacle of European civility. He was what upper-class people like to call amusing, which in 18th century code meant, I don't have to think too hard about your humanity. But here's the twist. Borulawski knew it. He played the role when it suited him, but he also used his position to carve out real autonomy. He wrote his memoirs later in life, dry, witty, and surprisingly modern in tone. At one point, he even remarked that being small wasn't his misfortune, but other people's inability to behave decently around him was. That's an 18th century mic drop if I've ever heard one. He eventually settled in England, living comfortably and respected, which is as close to a happy ending as this story gets. Nicholas Ferry, the tragic counterpoint. Now, if Borulawski was the success story, Nicholas Ferry, nicknamed Bébé, was the heartbreak. Born in 1741 in Lorraine, Bébé was brought to the court of King Stanislaus Leszczynski of Poland, who at the time was living his best French retirement as Duke of Lorraine. At first, the court adored Bébé. He was childlike, impulsive, and amusing, which unfortunately meant they treated him as exactly that, a child. He was dressed in brocade, fed sweets, shown off to guests, and used to lighten the mood at banquets. They even built him a tiny house within the palace grounds. Cute, right? Except, of course, it was basically a gilded cage. Unlike Borulawski, Bebe wasn't educated. He wasn't trained for anything but entertainment, and as he grew older, he didn't become wiser or more powerful, just lonelier. Reports from the court say he developed a temper, grew bitter, and even jealous when the king's attention waned. He wanted affection, but all he got was amusement. When Borulawski and Bebe actually met, yes, that happened, it did not go well. The court invited Borulawski to Lorraine, possibly thinking it would be adorable to have their two miniature gentlemen in the same room. Spoiler, it wasn't. Bebe reportedly flew into rage, insulted Borulawski, and tried to attack him with a candle snuffer. Borulawski, who was about half his weight but twice his social intelligence, narrowly escaped. Imagine being paraded for years as a royal toy and then being forced to share your only form of status. It wasn't jealousy in the shallow sense. It was despair, wearing silk. Bebe died in his mid-20s, malnourished and forgotten. His little house turned into a curiosity after his death. And the same nobles who had once cooed over him now displayed his skeleton in the Palace Museum. Because nothing says Enlightenment values like turning your favorite servant into a posthumous exhibit. Let's drift back to Russia again, because if there was ever a place where grandeur and brutality danced hand in hand, it was the imperial court of the Romanovs. After Empress Anna Ivanovna's ice palace stunt in the 1330s, her successors didn't exactly mellow out. They just refined the performance. Peter the Great had kept dwarfs too. He once hosted a dwarf wedding for 50 little people, purely to entertain his nobles. It was apparently a theatrical delight. Historians noted it was cheerful, because, of course, historians back then were also on the payroll. Catherine the Great, who prided herself on being enlightened, also had dwarfs at court, although she treated them somewhat more gently. Still, the system remained. They were there to amuse, to serve, and to remind everyone that even the rarest body could be turned into an ornament of power. At one banquet, Catherine reportedly dressed her dwarf attendants in matching gold outfits, calling them her shining stars. It sounds poetic until you realize they were lined up like living centerpieces between the guests and the dessert table. The line between flattery and cruelty was paper thin in that world. Everything was beauty and nothing was kindness. The English take: polite curiosity. Meanwhile, in England, the whole court dwarf thing had started to die out by the early 1700s, partly because the English preferred their weirdness to come with a veneer of good manners. But not completely. Queen Anne had kept a dwarf named Geoffrey Hudson, who had once served Queen Henrietta Maria a century earlier. Hudson was famous for being presented to the Queen in a pie, yes, literally hidden inside a giant pie, and then jumping out in full miniature armor. That was considered peak sophistication in 1626. You can't make this up. By the Georgian era, the English fascination had shifted more towards freak shows and natural curiosities, which is somehow worse. If you weren't a royal dwarf, you could end up on public display in taverns or traveling shows, your height reduced to a marketing slogan. Borulawski actually saw this coming. In his later years in England, he distanced himself from those exhibitions, insisting on being introduced as Count Borulawski. He wasn't a performer, he said. He was a gentleman who happened to be small. And people listened, mostly because he said it with enough dignity to make their guilt uncomfortable. So what was the deeper meaning behind all this obsession? Why did an entire continent of people with too much time and powdered faces find fascination in the size of someone else's body? Well, in short, because they could. In the rigid hierarchies of the 18th century, everything was about classification. People were categorized by rank, by gender, by birth, by religion, and by physical appearance. Difference was not something to understand, it was something to own. The dwarf servant fit perfectly into that system. They were rare enough to be remarkable, visible enough to be admired, and powerless enough to be controlled. They were the living metaphor for monarchy. Next, we'll float gently into the psychology behind all of it. The strange cocktail of guilt, piety, and boredom that made royals think this was okay. Because if you've ever wondered how people justified such cruelty with straight faces, well, that's coming next. Get comfortable. We'll keep the candlelight low and the pace slow. Hey again. Still awake? That's okay if you're not. Honestly, that's the point. But if your eyes are half closed and you're just following the sound of the story, we're moving now into the mental furniture of the 18th century. What made powerful people think owning smaller people was perfectly fine, even fashionable? Because the truth is, this wasn't random. It came from a specific blend of religion, insecurity, and the human tendency to make status out of suffering. God's curiosities, the religious framing. Let's start with religion. In an era when theology explained everything from politics to plumbing, difference in the body was usually interpreted as divine intent. If someone was born unusually tall or small, or with physical differences, it wasn't seen as a medical condition, it was a sign, a message from above. And if you were a king or a queen, well, you were already God's chosen messenger, so clearly that sign must be meant for you. That's how the idea of God's curiosities began. Royal clerics would tell monarchs that dwarfs were living reminders of divine mystery, proof that creation came in all forms and therefore must be admired. Admired, of course, in the most hierarchical way possible, from a throne, at a distance, ideally, while someone poured your wine. It sounds absurd now, but that justification allowed nobles to convince themselves that keeping a little person in their household wasn't exploitation, it was education. They were studying creation. You know, in the same way that people study a caged parrot while drinking tea. Superstition and luck, the tiny talismans. Then there was superstition, because when logic fails, humans reach for magic, and the 18th century, despite all its Enlightenment talk, was still drenched in old beliefs. Across Europe, dwarfs were thought to bring good luck. Their presence supposedly warded off misfortune and softened bad omens. This wasn't unique to royalty. Even merchants and minor nobles sometimes tried to befriend or employ someone with dwarfism, believing it would bless their household. In Spain, some families even had household portraits with their dwarf servants painted in, holding a symbolic item, a mirror, a dog, or a rose, representing fortune or wisdom. The logic went something like this. If I keep this person near me, my fate will improve. If I lose them, bad luck will follow. It was spiritual insurance, written in gold thread and self-delusion. And like all superstition mixed with power, it quickly turned cruel. Because once someone becomes your talisman, they stop being a person. The theater of hierarchy. But beyond the religion and the superstition, there was something even more fundamental: performance. The 18th century ran on ceremony the way modern life runs on Wi-Fi. Everything was a show. Royalty wasn't about ruling anymore. It was about being seen ruling. Every meal, every greeting, every outfit was a scripted display of hierarchy. And in that endless stage play, dwarf servants served as visual punctuation marks. They emphasized contrast. They reminded guests, consciously or not, of how far removed the monarch was from ordinary existence. If the king looked grand beside normal courtiers, imagine how divine he looked beside someone half his height. It's disgusting, yes, but to them, it was design. Even their placement was strategic. In portraits, dwarfs often appear near the foot of the throne or beside a child, always slightly below eye level, symbolically grounding the image. They were props in the architecture of power, as crucial to the visual grammar of monarchy as a crown or a scepter. Boredom as a royal disease. And then there's boredom. You can't overstate it. Royal boredom was practically a pandemic. Imagine having everything: power, luxury, servants, music, and absolutely nothing real to do. No purpose, no productivity, no weekend plans beyond attending your own banquets. So what do you do when life is just one long, silk-draped weeding room? You invent distractions. Some hunted foxes, some collected clocks, and some collected people. Keeping a dwarf servant became one of many amusements in the long parade of royal idleness, a walking novelty, a daily reminder that you could rewrite the world's rules just for fun. To modern ears, it sounds cruel, and it was, but for the 18th century elite, cruelty was often invisible if it wore lace. Guilt, compassion, and the art of pretending. Now, not every royal was heartless. A few genuinely cared for their dwarf attendants. Letters survive from noblewomen writing affectionately about their dear little friend, sending gifts or ensuring pensions after death. But even that affection was trapped inside the same hierarchy. They might call them family, but never equal. It's a pattern that repeats across history. Compassion without equality. The ability to be kind, but only within comfortable boundaries. It's a sort of moral half-sleep, the same kind that lets someone pet a caged bird and still feel gentle about it. The 18th century was excellent at that. The Enlightenment paradox. Here's where it gets almost funny, in the darkly ironic way. The same century that produced philosophers preaching liberty and reason also kept human beings as decorative curiosities. Voltaire was writing about human dignity, while Catherine the Great hosted dwarf balls. Rousseau wrote about equality, while the salons of Paris applauded when a nobleman's pet dwarf performed a song. It's almost poetic in its hypocrisy, the Enlightenment shining its bright light everywhere except inside the palace. Because in the end, the idea of universal dignity was a thought experiment, not a dinner guest. The nobility wanted enlightenment without inconvenience. They wanted reason without reform. And so the little people stayed, at court, at banquets, in portraits, quietly contradicting every ideal the century claimed to love. Science steps in, sort of. By the late 1700s, science started to chip away at superstition. Doctors began studying dwarfism as a medical condition rather than a mystical sign. But predictably, science didn't bring empathy right away. It brought classification. Natural philosophers began collecting measurements, drawings, and even specimens. Anatomical museums paid to display skeletal remains, often unethically. Remember poor Bebe from the Duke of Lorraine's court? His skeleton ended up in the Natural History collection of Nancy, labeled as a remarkable example of miniature human form. That's what progress looked like. Less mysticism, more measurement, same objectification. It would take another century and a lot more pain before the conversation shifted from how strange to how human. Royal mirrors, seeing themselves in miniature. There's another layer to all this, one a bit psychological, a bit poetic. Some historians argue that royals surrounded themselves with dwarfs not just to show contrast, but to see reflection. A dwarf courtier was a distorted mirror of monarchy itself, small, isolated, dependent on the whims of those above, but still crucial to the show. When kings looked down at their attendants, they might have seen, without realizing, their own condition, a life of performance, containment, and spectacle. Both were trapped in different scales of the same cage. Maybe that's why some monarchs showed affection. They recognized a fragment of themselves, refracted through size and circumstance. It doesn't excuse anything, but it does make the story eerily symmetrical. Power's quiet logic. So when you put it all together, religion, superstition, hierarchy, boredom, guilt, it forms a kind of quiet logic. If you live in a world where status is everything, you start to measure humanity like furniture. Some people are thrones, some are chandeliers, and some, tragically, are conversation pieces. That's what royal fascination with dwarf servants was, an architecture of human difference built to make the powerful feel taller. And if that sounds grotesque, remember they didn't think of it that way. They thought of it as elegance, which, in a way, might be history's darkest punchline. Drifting toward decline. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Enlightenment had become revolution. The French were guillotining their old hierarchies, and the idea of keeping a human being for decoration suddenly seemed dangerous. The courts that survived quietly dismissed their dwarf servants or rebranded them as companions. The titles softened, but the memories lingered. In portraits, their faces still gaze out, poised, weary, and strangely timeless, tiny witnesses to centuries of extravagance, carrying the calm that only the observed can know. So, take a breath. We floated through the gold leaf psychology of a vanished world, one that dressed cruelty in lace and called it taste. But we're not done yet. Next, we'll drift gently into the legacy, how those 18th century fascinations shaped later popular culture, circus history, and even the modern idea of difference. Because once a society learns to turn people into symbols, it doesn't unlearn it overnight. So, the palaces are cooling down now. The candlelight of the 18th century has burned to stubs, and the powdered wigs have gone out of fashion. Revolutions have done their cutting, kings are losing their heads or their patience, and the word royal is starting to sound a little old-fashioned. But one thing doesn't disappear so easily: fascination. The royal obsession with difference, with human bodies that stood out, didn't die when monarchies fell. It just changed venue. If the 18th century displayed little people in gilded halls, the 19th century moved them to the stage. From marble corridors to circus tents, from painted portraits to printed posters. Same curiosity, new costume. The industrial age discovers the human exhibit. As Europe industrialized, entertainment industrialized, and nothing sold tickets quite like a good spectacle. Cities filled with noise, smog, and restless crowds. People needed diversion. And out of that need came a new kind of showman, men who could turn the unusual into an attraction. The old royal attitude of owning a curiosity became a public business model. Bodies that had once been admired privately by kings were now displayed for pennies to workers, students, and families looking for a Sunday thrill. If the 18th century dwarf was a symbol of status, the 19th century dwarf became a symbol of entertainment. And no one understood this transition better than an American named P.T. Barnum. Ah, yes, Barnum, the man who could sell a sneeze if he wrapped it in velvet. In the 1840s, Barnum introduced the world to General Tom Thumb, whose real name was Charles Stratton. Stratton was just 5 years old when Barnum discovered him and began marketing him as a miniature military man, complete with tiny uniforms, carriages, and a stage persona that blended comedy with tragedy. Tom Thumb became an international sensation. He met Queen Victoria, toured Europe, and performed for crowds that would have once gathered to glimpse royalty. It's easy to see why people found him charming. He was witty, talented, and played the role perfectly. But it's also easy to see the continuity. He was still being displayed. Barnum called it showmanship, but really it was just the same old royal fascination, democratized and monetized. The throne had been replaced by a ticket booth. The Victorian gaze, science, sympathy, and spectacle. The Victorians, of course, had to complicate everything with a thick layer of moral confusion. On one hand, they prided themselves on scientific curiosity. Museums popped up everywhere, displaying fossils, artifacts, and human bodies alike. People with dwarfism were studied, measured, photographed. Anthropology became fashionable. On the other hand, they also liked to pretend they were being sympathetic. Victorian literature often portrayed little people as tragic, fragile, or saintly, miniature embodiments of suffering and virtue. You can see it in art and novels, tiny figures cast as symbols of purity or endurance. Society had moved from mockery to melancholy, but the subject was still the same. People were still being turned into metaphors. It's a strange kind of progress, less cruelty, more pity, neither particularly humanizing. Then came photography, the mirror that never blinks. Suddenly, the old portrait traditions of Velázquez and Van Dyck were replaced by studios offering stiff, sepia-toned immortality. And once again, dwarf entertainers, artists, and performers became popular subjects. Photographers loved contrast, tall and short, rich and poor, beauty and anomaly. It was the same visual logic as those royal portraits, one person's dignity framed by another's difference. Even as medicine began to classify dwarfism more precisely, the visual culture of the time kept treating it as a spectacle. In a way, the camera just made the old court gaze permanent. Frozen forever in glass and silver nitrate, the public's curiosity caught mid-stare. The circus as the new Versailles. By the late 19th century, the circus was the new palace. It had everything the courts used to offer: music, performance, costumes, hierarchy, and a very selective version of humanity. The so-called freak shows weren't invented by cruelty alone. They were inherited from centuries of aristocratic entertainment. The only real change was who held the power, not monarchs, but managers. For many performers, the circus offered more agency than the court ever had. They were paid, they could travel, and they could, to a degree, choose how to present themselves. Some became rich. General Tom Thumb married Lavinia Warren, another performer with dwarfism, in what newspapers called the fairy wedding of the century. Thousands attended. It was treated like a royal event, complete with a parade, fine clothes, and excessive press coverage. So yes, equality of spectacle, if not of dignity. Public fascination becomes public guilt. But by the early 20th century, something began to shift. Science had advanced, psychology had arrived, and people started to feel a creeping sense of unease about laughing at difference. The freak show began to fade, partly out of changing tastes, partly out of shame. Audiences still looked, but they pretended not to. The old voyeurism became cultural nostalgia. Films like The Wizard of Oz in 1939 brought dwarf actors into mainstream entertainment, but the framing remained fairy tale, not reality. The idea of smallness was still mythologized, gentle, cute, magical. a direct descendant of those 18th century fantasies about little companions. The names changed, the script didn't. Royal shadows in modern times. And meanwhile, the royal families themselves, the descendants of those same 18th century collectors, quietly erased that part of their history. You won't find court dwarfs mentioned in official palace tours or museum displays, except in the faintest academic footnotes. The portraits still hang, but the names of the small figures are rarely printed on the labels. It's easier, after all, to remember the wigs and the jewels than the people who stood beside them. Some modern historians, though, are beginning to restore those identities, tracing names, letters, even pension records to rebuild their stories. It turns out that many of them were smarter, wittier, and more resilient than their so-called masters. Borulovsky, for example, outlived most of his noble patrons and left behind a memoir that outlasted their reputations. He wrote that the only real difference between him and the lords who laughed at him was height, and perhaps he added temperance, a polite 18th century way of saying, "I was less ridiculous than you." From ornament to advocate. Fast forward a few centuries, and the descendants of those performers, people with dwarfism today, have turned that long history of objectification into activism. Organizations around the world now fight for visibility on their own terms. Representation in media, not as curiosities or comic relief, but as full people, with jobs, families, humor, and normal lives. It's a quiet reclamation, turning centuries of objectification into self-definition, taking back the stage that once turned them into props. The irony, of course, is that the royal fascination that once dehumanized them also preserved their stories. Through paintings, letters, and portraits, we still know their names, when countless servants and peasants vanished into history's shadows. It's bittersweet immortality, but it's immortality nonetheless. Memory and silence. There's something haunting about those portraits, though. If you ever walk through the Prado Museum in Madrid, or the Louvre, or any European gallery filled with royal art, you'll see them. The small figures, always near the edge of the frame. They stand beside golden thrones, holding a cushion or a pet, their eyes calm, their expressions unreadable. They were meant to be background, but centuries later, they're the ones we look at longest, because we know now what the painters didn't, that the smallest people in those rooms probably understood power better than anyone else there. A long exhale. So here's where the story exhales. From the icy palaces of Russia to the stages of New York, from gilded cages to theater lights, the strange, sad fascination of the 18th century royals carried its echo through every age that followed. It began as vanity, transformed into entertainment, and is only now, slowly, turning into understanding. History doesn't move in straight lines. It loops, hesitates, circles back, like a candle flame catching its breath. And somewhere in that flicker are all the small figures history tried to turn into symbols, still standing quietly at the edge of the frame, still reminding us what power looks like when it forgets what empathy means. Let's drift to the end. So, if you're still awake, and it's perfectly fine if you're not, that's where we'll leave it for tonight. The Age of Royal Dwarfs wasn't just a story about the powerful and the powerless. It was about the human habit of turning difference into display, and the slow, stubborn effort to turn display back into dignity. From Versailles to Barnum's stage, from candlelight to spotlights, same fascination, same small figures, endlessly reframed. Maybe, if history ever learns to look without staring, they'll finally rest. Until then, good night, travelers of time, and may your dreams be free of golden cages. Hey, you made it! That means either you're deeply fascinated by the quiet corners of royal history, or you've been drifting in and out of half dreams for the past 20 minutes. Both are fine. That's kind of the point. We've spent hours wandering through palaces, paintings, and parades, looking at the tiniest figures in the grandest rooms. And now we're standing in the echo, in that strange hush that follows centuries of spectacle. So let's slow it all the way down. Because in the end, this isn't really a story about dwarf servants or kings or freak shows. It's a story about what people do with power and what they do to people when they get too used to holding it. When wonder turns into wound. The royal fascination with little people started as a form of wonder, a sort of childish awe at the variety of the human form. But somewhere along the line, it became ownership. Because wonder, when combined with privilege, tends to mutate. What begins as how extraordinary becomes how convenient, and then, inevitably, mine. Every portrait, every banquet, every mocking nickname was a small act of turning a person into a prop. And yet, history being what it is, we still inherited the paintings, not the people. The irony of it all, the monarchs who bought, displayed, and posed with dwarf companions thought they were immortalizing their own glory. But the longer you look, the more your eyes slide past the throne, past the lace and the jewels, and settle on the quiet face beside it. The small figures who refused to vanish. Some of them slipped away into silence, yes. We'll never know their stories, their laughter, or what they whispered when the court grew dull. But others wrote, performed, and even fought back. Joseph Butterwowski with his memoirs, Henriette the Wise, who managed the French queen's household, and countless others who left no books, but plenty of whispers in the archives, pensions paid, letters sent, portraits commissioned. In each age, they redefined the space given to them. The court might have called them ornaments, but they lived as observers, survivors, even celebrities. There's something quietly heroic about that, existing with grace in a world that tried to turn your existence into decoration. What history forgets and what it remembers. You can tell a lot about an era by who it decides to remember. Kings have tombs, artists have signatures, but the ones who stood beside them, the servants, the jesters, the favorites, they usually fade away. And yet, when you look closely, those little figures remain, stubbornly, in the art. Not erased, just waiting to be noticed properly this time. Maybe history's memory works like the human mind before sleep, random, wandering, occasionally kind. It lets some things go, but clings to fragments that still matter. The faces in the margins of old paintings matter. The servants in silks, the companions beside queens, they were part of the architecture of power, but also its conscience. The long echo of the gaze. That's the other thread in all of this, the gaze. In every century, people with unusual bodies have been looked at, sometimes with awe, sometimes cruelty, sometimes false kindness, always looked at, rarely looked into. And the difference between those two is everything. The royals thought they were celebrating uniqueness, but really they were projecting their own obsession with control over beauty, nature, and even the definition of normal. Modern media isn't so different. Reality shows, clickbait, social media, the lens has changed, but the habit hasn't. We still turn difference into content, just with better lighting. It's hard not to when curiosity and cruelty share such a thin border. Empathy as an invention. Here's a weird thought. Empathy, as we know it, is a modern invention. The word itself only really entered European languages in the late 19th century. For centuries, people didn't lack compassion. They just didn't frame it as a moral expectation. A king could treat someone as both precious and subhuman in the same breath, and no one blinked. Today, we at least notice the contradiction. That's progress. Slow, clumsy, imperfect, but real. Because empathy grows through hindsight. It's what happens when curiosity finally gets tired of staring and decides to listen. The weight of smallness. If there's one quiet thread running through this entire story, it's the way smallness has always been magnified by power. In the 18th century, small was exotic. In the 19th, small was entertainment. In the 20th, small became metaphor. And maybe in the 21st, small can finally just mean human. It's easy to forget that being looked at too much is its own kind of invisibility. But maybe, slowly, history's lens is softening. We're learning, haltingly, to let the small be seen without being consumed. A soft lesson in perspective. So maybe that's what this long, drowsy history lesson has been about. Not the palaces or the politics, but perspective. The same perspective painters used when they decided who to put in the center and who to leave at the edge. For centuries, we stared at the center, the crowns, the robes, the faces history told us were important. But it turns out the edge of the canvas was where the real story was standing, quietly, patiently, waiting for us to look their way. Fading candlelight. You can almost imagine it now. A marble hall, a portrait half finished, the painter leaning back, brushing gold leaf over a royal cuff, and beside that grand figure, a smaller one, still, steady, watching the whole process unfold. The painter dips the brush, sighs, and mutters something about proportion. The candle flickers. The air smells like turpentine and dust. And for just a moment, the small figure in the portrait lifts their eyes, not toward the king, but toward us. It's such a quiet rebellion, just eye contact stretched across centuries. Good night, and let it rest. So that's where we'll leave it tonight, in that flicker, that single, almost invisible act of being seen. If you're still awake, take one slow breath. If you're not, that's okay too. You've just dreamed your way through palaces, portraits, and centuries of human oddness. Because history isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it just sits in a gilded chair, looking small, but knowing everything. And if tonight's story has done its job, maybe you'll remember those little faces, not as ornaments, but as people who survived the strangest job description in Europe. So close your eyes, let the courts fade into quiet, the candles out, The story's done. Good night.